Aha! We're back. The first of these sessions is actually in the process of uploading to YouTube. And shit. Well, since I broke off, I've been thinking about how I broke off, and actually how I developed things earlier, and became a bit unhappy with that. So at the risk of hopelessly confusing the entire endeavor, I would like to switch gears. I will certainly come back to a far more elaborate presentation of Foucault's notion of power and the formation of the individual. First, however, I think it's important to say something about the method employed by Foucault, or the methods employed by Foucault in his various works. Because, well, they're quite revolutionary, and they also betray the various philosophical, I don't want to say prejudices. Well, actually he is attempting to escape particular philosophical prejudices, particularly those of phenomenology, well, that in philosophy, and but also the prejudice of traditional historiography, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Early in his career, Foucault published The History of Madness and the Classical Age in 1961. In 1963, he published The Birth of the Clinic. In 1966, he published The Order of Things, an incredibly difficult book, his most difficult book by far, but the book which, oddly enough, made him a star in France. It's with that book that Foucault comes to eclipse Jean-Paul Sartre as the intellectual, as the public intellectual of the country. It's said that everyone who was anyone in France had a copy of The Order of Things laying on their coffee table, although I can assure you that the vast majority of them could not possibly have had the proper background to understand the incredibly complex arguments that he makes therein. So 3 years after The Order of Things comes The Archeology of Knowledge. What he does in that book is to lay bare the assumptions of the method, the archeological method, which he had used from History of Madness through The Order of Things. He had realized that there was a shortcoming in that method, and this led him to combine archaeology with genealogy, and that's what so I'm going to give a little bit of background and then talk about those two methods and go from there. So, in formulating the methodology of archaeology, the premise of archaeology is to show that the various discursive formations, this is Foucault's vocabulary, which hold sway in a particular period in time, are actually the result not of a conscious decisions made by individual subjects, as, for example, phenomenology would have it be, and also as traditional historical methods would suggest these models or paradigms actually develop. Instead, these formations are governed by rules which are found below the level of consciousness of subjects, which allows for the historian to dive into the unconscious and contingent factors which determine, according to Foucault and according to many others, which determine the particular boundaries and methods of thought employed in a given time, in a given discipline, and so forth. To say something about his rejection of conscious, the suzerainty of the conscious subject. This goes back. Well, it goes beyond Kant, but Kant actually established most forcefully this notion. And structuralism is a reaction against this. Foucault was not particularly influenced by Levi-Strauss. Instead, his big influences were through structuralist psychology and linguistics, represented by Jacques Lacan on the one hand, and Ferdinand de Saussure on the other, and also by the studies of comparative religion done by the far too neglected scholar Georges Dumezil. Really fantastic work. Although, frankly, I know one person other than my nerdy self who's actually taken the time to read these studies. They're quite extraordinary. Okay, so archaeology begins as quite key to Foucault's thought precisely because it does allow for him to, it does support the view that history is not driven by conscious intention. That individual subjects do not develop some agenda which establishes the course of history, and here's the influence of structuralism upon him. And actually, I am relying somewhat more upon notes now than I was earlier. As I was making notes earlier, it struck me that yeah, it is a good idea to have at least something in front of me. So, archaeology is essential to what he wants to do. However, there's a critical flaw to archaeology. Archaeology allows for the comparison of contingent formations within in different periods of history. However, the critical force of the archaeological method is significantly blunted by the fact that it cannot account for what is most important to Foucault, namely the contingent formations which establish the way we think today here in the modern era. There's simply archaeology simply offers no insight into. In fact, it would more or less explicitly suggest well, it would more or less suggest that we could not say a whole lot about how contemporary thought comes to be codified as it is through various contingent conjunctions. So recognizing this, Foucault turns to one of his great idols, Nietzsche, and develops genealogical analysis. This is a reference to Nietzsche's extraordinary book on the genealogy of morals, where he shows, where Nietzsche quite forcefully exhibits that prevailing tendencies, in this case morality, right, are very often the result of base, inglorious, even quotidian origins. And he's specifically, of course, referring to the morality of the 19th century, which is largely dominated by the church. The important suggestion here is that there is, contrary to most all philosophical belief at the time, Nietzsche